My name is Miriam Fall, and I will be presenting a construction cost analysis based off of the private versus the public sector. You gave us this data to really talk about the different construction costs, preferably by month. However, I'll be analyzing it by month and by year. For the introduction, we are going to just briefly look at a graph on your right that shows the construction cost by month. The blue trend line is going to be the private plot, and the orange trend line is the public plot. You can see just based off of the graph that the private construction costs are significantly higher than the public costs, and it's almost double over the course of 140 plus months. For the agenda, we're briefly going to just be looking at the construction costs and what they depend on. So we're going to be looking at the seasonality of it per year, the private versus the public build or construction costs in that sense. And of course, we're going to want to answer a few questions. So what patterns exist within the data? What are the possible root causes for the trend lines that we see? And I'm going to discuss some of the findings that I found in this analysis. And some of those are just that summer months have higher construction costs, both in public and private. The average costs for public are significantly lower than private. Average costs in private will decline after 2026, while public increases after 2027. Strong correlation, and the data repeats every 12 months. So with that being said, we're going to go into our first topic, which is going to be a focus on the private sector. So for private construction, I have two graphs here, but before we get into the graphs, I kind of want to discuss the methodology behind the actual analysis. So first we did a moving average just so that we can get rid of any of the kinks in the data, any seasonality fluctuations. And you can see on the right side of the graph, the first graph there, you'll see that from 2023 to around 2026, you have high construction costs. And then after we pass over to 2027, you see that slow decline and then like a small increase from 2031 and on. The second graph below shows the cyclicality. And the cyclicality is essentially the raw data minus the moving average. And that just provides us the residuals, which is essentially any remainders in the graph. With that being said, the cyclicality shows from cycle to cycle. And like I discussed in the previous slide, it is a 12-month period. So we are seeing that within the 6th all the way to the 8th month every year, we're seeing a low residual. What that means is that the actual value is really less than the predicted value in the summer. Just a few root causes. The private is commissioned and paid by private institutions, which is most likely the reason for the high cost there. Just in addition to that, most likely the private sector will have large projects. And in the data, we see that there are higher costs. So we are seeing that large projects, which are most likely more expensive because they're going to be more innovative buildings, especially going into the next few years. Now we're going to move forward to the public construction. Here, obviously, as I already mentioned, we do see a lower spend in the public construction. In the public construction, we do see slight increases from 2027 and on. However, just not as much as we see in the private sector. Same cyclicality in the public sector. It's not exactly the same, but very similar in the sense where we do see a strong correlation of 0.98 in the summer months, which, as I mentioned before, just essentially means that the actual value was less than the predicted value. So some of the possible root causes that we have here, new legislation is coming in, which is increasing the cost over the years. For public construction, it does need to go through an approval process, which is typically slower than the private, because it's private is private and public is going to go through the government and whatever rules or regulations they have. So we are going to see possibly that increasing over the next few years. Another item on the list here is just limited funds for construction. And that just may be due to limited costs within the government and things that maybe were not allocated towards public construction or things of that nature. Lastly, just smaller projects over time. It's possible that the public sector just didn't have as many large projects in the pipeline, which therefore, caused that decrease or the smaller value in the earlier months. But then once, they were able to pick up the speed and things of that nature, you'll see that increase moving on from 2027. For my summary, findings and possible root causes. Just to reiterate, significantly lower costs in the public sector compared to private. Both sectors show actual value was less than predicted value in summer months, and then less funding and slower approval in the public, more work and more money in private. Some of my recommendations would be to look into new legislation and what is really driving that higher cost. Does the government have enough work in the pipeline that's actually generating enough revenue compared to the private? Do we need to create, any kind of new work that would really increase the cost that we're spending each month and year over year? Do we need to revisit the approval process? What is taking so long for us to get, to the new or the next project? And lastly, possibly take on some private projects, which would increase what we're actually spending month over month and year over year. And that is all I have for the construction cost analysis. And thank you all so much for listening.